Nebraska Sandhills, 1899. While every homesteader rushed to build with logs or sod before winter, Norwegian immigrant Ole Jensen was still stacking what looked like giant hay bricks in late September. His neighbors called it foolish. They called him poor. He built walls 2 feet thick from compressed prairie grass bales, plastered with local clay mud. They finished their cabins in 3 weeks. He spent 2 months on what they dismissed as a haystack house. Then January 21st arrived. The blizzard struck without warning. 40-mile-per-hour winds, temperatures plunging to 20 below zero. 7 brutal months that would be remembered as the hard winter. Log cabins collapsed under snow loads. Sod houses leaked and froze solid. Families burned through entire cords of firewood and still couldn't stay warm. But that hay bale fortress? Inside, children played without shivering, while neighbors froze just yards away. What did this Norwegian understand about insulation and thermodynamics that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The Nebraska sandhills stretched endlessly in all directions, a rolling sea of grass-covered dunes that had confounded homesteaders since the first wagons rolled west. Unlike the rich black earth of Iowa or the dense prairie sod of eastern Nebraska, this sandy soil crumbled in your hands. The few trees that managed to take root, cottonwoods hugging creek beds, scattered willows in low spots, were stunted and sparse. Most homesteaders arriving here discovered too late that the traditional frontier solutions simply wouldn't work. Jim Caldwell had learned this the hard way. The Kentucky-born farmer arrived in 1878 with grand plans for a log cabin like his grandfather had built in the Appalachian foothills. But after riding for 3 days in any direction, he found barely enough timber to frame a chicken coop, let alone a house. The few decent logs available cost more to haul from the Niobrara River than most families saw in cash all year. Even the sod houses that dotted the eastern plains proved nearly impossible here. The sandy soil produced thin, weak strips that crumbled within weeks of cutting. Caldwell had watched his neighbor's sod walls literally blow away during a summer thunderstorm, leaving a family of 5 sleeping under a wagon tarp. The Homestead Act demanded proof of improvement, a dwelling, cultivated acres, evidence of permanent settlement. The later Kincaid Act doubled the land grants in the Sandhills but kept the same requirements. Families had to build something, anything, to hold their claims. Most cobbled together frame shacks using expensive shipped lumber, thin-walled structures that leaked heat faster than a man could split firewood. Others dug dugouts into hillsides, dark caves that stayed damp all winter and flooded every spring. Then old Jensen arrived in 1887 with a different idea entirely. The Norwegian immigrant had spent his first decade in America working the lumber camps of Minnesota, where he'd learned to spot the difference between practical building and mere tradition. In the forests of his homeland, survival meant using what the land provided, not what your grandfather had used. When Jensen saw the endless prairie grass of the sandhills, some stems reaching 8 feet tall, dense as wheat in a good year, he saw building material that everyone else was burning or baling for cattle feed. The mechanical hay balers had revolutionized prairie farming by the 1880s. Steam-powered machines could compress loose grass into rectangular bales, weighing 90 to 100 pounds each, tight enough that you could barely drive a nail through them. Most homesteaders used these bales to feed livestock through the winter months. Jensen saw them differently. Each bale measured roughly 14 inches wide, 18 inches tall, and 36 inches long, the dimensions of massive masonry blocks, but lighter and far more insulating than stone or brick. Through the summer of 1898, Jensen began construction of what would become the talk of Cherry County. He laid a foundation of native stones, raising his first course of bales 8 inches off the ground to prevent moisture damage. The walls rose slowly, each bale laid like a giant brick in running bond pattern, joints staggered for maximum strength. 24 inches thick at the base, double the width of any log cabin wall in the territory. His neighbors gathered to watch and shake their heads. "What good is a haystack for a house?" Caldwell asked anyone who would listen. "First strong wind will scatter it to Kansas." Others were less polite. The local blacksmith called it the biggest waste of good hay he'd ever seen. The postmaster's wife declared it an embarrassment to decent folk, a clear sign that Jensen couldn't afford proper materials. Children dared each other to throw stones at the strange golden walls, wondering if they'd bounce off or punch straight through. Jensen ignored them all and kept building. He notched each bale with a chainsaw to fit around door and window frames, then compressed the walls using long wooden pins driven through multiple courses. The roof structure used minimal timber, just enough rafters to support cedar shingles, with no need for the heavy beams required by conventional log construction. Where others might use dozens of expensive logs, Jensen needed perhaps a dozen pieces of dimensional lumber, most of it salvaged from packing crates and abandoned wagons. The strangest part was the plastering. Jensen mixed local clay with sand and chopped straw, creating what old-timers called gumbo mud. This mixture, applied in thick coats over wire mesh, sealed the entire structure against wind and weather. The finished walls looked almost normal from a distance, until you noticed their extraordinary thickness and the way they seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. Reverend Samuel Weaver, the Methodist circuit rider who had seen Native American earth lodges and Canadian homesteads, was the only local voice defending Jensen's methods. "I've wintered in structures you'd call primitive," he told skeptics after Sunday services. "Thickness matters more than beauty when the thermometer drops." But the mockery continued. As autumn approached and Jensen's family prepared to move in, neighbors wagered on how long the haystack house would stand. Some bet it wouldn't survive the first serious windstorm. Others figured the mice would eat them out of house and home before Christmas. The smell of cured grass, they claimed, would attract every rat in the territory. By late September, the Jensen family was settled in their unusual home, while their neighbors rushed to complete more conventional dwellings. Caldwell finished chinking his log cabin just as the first frost appeared on the grass. The school teacher moved into her frame house with walls so thin you could push a pencil through the gaps between boards. The German family down the creek completed their dugout, proud of its solid earth walls and grateful for its protection from the wind. October brought the first real test, a 3-day storm with driving rain that turned to sleet. Conventional structures leaked and groaned, their occupants shivering under extra blankets and stoking fires through the night. The Jensen place stood silent and solid, no lights flickering in the windows, no smoke pouring from the chimney. When neighbors stopped by to check on the family, they found the interior surprisingly comfortable. The thick walls had absorbed the day's warmth and were releasing it slowly through the night. Jensen barely needed to tend his fire. Still, most dismissed this as autumn weather, nothing compared to what winter would bring. The real test, they assured each other, would come when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind howled for weeks without relief. Then they'd see if compressed grass could match the proven strength of log and sod, timber and stone. By November, the first snows were already deeper than usual, and old-timers began predicting a hard winter ahead. The signs appeared in late November, subtle at first, but unmistakable to anyone who'd lived through more than a few prairie winters. Snow fell 3 weeks earlier than usual, dusting the grass while cattle were still grazing in the open. The temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight on November 20th, then stayed there for a week. Old-timers who remembered the brutal winter of 1857 began checking their firewood supplies and muttering about bad omens. By December 1st, 18 inches of snow covered the ground, more than most years saw all winter. The Niobrara River, which rarely froze completely, showed ice thick enough to walk on. Weather records from the nearest army post would later document the most severe early winter conditions in 40 years of frontier settlement. But homesteaders didn't need official measurements to know they were facing something unprecedented. Jim Caldwell's log cabin began revealing its weaknesses almost immediately. He'd built it the traditional way his grandfather had taught him, single walls of 8-inch logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace against the north wall where it would draw best. The construction had served 3 generations in Kentucky's milder climate, but the Nebraska wind found every gap between the logs. Frost formed on the interior walls 3 feet from the fireplace, something Caldwell had never witnessed in all his years on the frontier. The chinking, a mixture of clay, grass, and horsehair, dried out in the arid prairie air and began cracking within weeks of the first freeze. Each gap, no matter how small, became a pathway for frigid air. Caldwell spent hours each day replastering the worst spots, but new cracks appeared faster than he could seal them. By mid-December, he was burning 4 cords of firewood per month, double his normal consumption, and his family still huddled around the fire wearing coats indoors. The school teacher's frame house suffered even worse. Built with shipped lumber and standard construction techniques, the walls consisted of 2-inch planks with no insulation between them. The gaps between boards, invisible during construction, opened wider as the wood contracted in the cold. Wind whistled through the structure so clearly that candle flames flickered from cross breezes. She stuffed rags and newspaper into every crack she could find, but the building seemed determined to leak heat faster than her small stove could produce it. 3 families living in dugouts faced different but equally serious problems. The earth walls that promised natural insulation proved treacherous when moisture seeped through from above. Underground seepage froze into sheets of ice on the interior walls, creating surfaces that radiated cold throughout the small spaces. The Schmidt family woke each morning to find water buckets frozen solid, despite keeping a fire burning all night. Their youngest daughter developed a persistent cough that echoed ominously in the confined space. The German settlers, who had managed to construct a sod house, discovered that sandhill soil produced fundamentally different building material than the dense prairie sod of eastern Nebraska. Their walls, built from thin strips of sandy earth and sparse grass, began crumbling under the freeze-thaw cycles. What should have been solid blocks of compressed earth became loose piles of frozen dirt. Chunks fell away from the walls during windstorms, leaving gaps that no amount of replastering could permanently seal. Firewood became the critical limiting factor for survival. The scattered cottonwoods and willows had been harvested heavily during the settlement's first decade, leaving families to burn everything from corn cobs to twisted grass for heat. Those who could afford it paid premium prices for coal shipped by rail, but most relied on whatever deadwood they could scavenge from creek beds and abandoned homesteads. Families that had calculated they needed 3 cords to survive the winter were burning through 5 cords by Christmas, with 3 months of cold weather still ahead. Children in conventional houses developed chilblains on their hands and feet. Mothers wrapped their babies in multiple layers of quilts and still worried about hypothermia during the coldest nights. The local doctor, making his rounds on horseback, reported more cases of frostbite and cold-related illness than he'd seen in 15 years of prairie practice. Several families began discussing abandoning their claims and retreating to warmer towns until spring. Meanwhile, the Jensen household presented a stark contrast that became impossible to ignore. Neighbors walking past the straw bale house noticed how little smoke rose from its chimney compared to other dwellings. While Caldwell's fireplace roared constantly and the schoolteacher's stove glowed red-hot, Jensen's fire seemed almost decorative, a modest flame that burned steadily but never urgently. The thick walls absorbed heat during the day and released it gradually through the night, maintaining comfortable temperatures with minimal fuel consumption. The compressed grass bales, plastered inside and out with gumbo mud, created an insulating barrier that conventional construction couldn't match. Each hollow grass stem trapped still air, multiplying the insulating effect thousands of times over. The 2-foot-thick walls provided an estimated R value of 50 or higher, compared to single-digit ratings for log cabins and frame houses. More importantly, the plaster created an airtight seal that eliminated the infiltration problems plaguing other structures. Jensen's children played comfortably indoors wearing normal clothing while neighbor children huddled in coats and blankets. His wife baked bread regularly, something other families had abandoned because their houses stayed too cold for yeast to work properly. When the wind howled across the prairie at night, the Jensen house remained silent inside, the thick walls absorbing sound as effectively as they retained heat. The contrast became so obvious that some neighbors began finding excuses to visit, lingering in the warm interior while making conversation about weather and crops. Jensen welcomed them graciously, serving coffee and discussing farming techniques, but he noticed how reluctant they were to return to their own frigid homes. The mockery that had defined attitudes toward his haystack house gradually transformed into something resembling envy, though few were willing to admit their conventional wisdom might be wrong. By early January, temperatures were consistently dropping below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, with the coldest nights reaching -15. The wind never seemed to stop, driving snow into drifts that buried fences and threatened to cover single-story buildings. Several homesteaders had already loaded their families into wagons and headed for town, abandoning their claims rather than risk freezing to death in structures that couldn't keep pace with the brutal conditions. The stage was set for a test that would separate working solutions from merely traditional ones. January 21st, 1899, began deceptively calm. The morning temperature hovered near 0 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but manageable for families who had survived the previous month of harsh conditions. Children ventured outside to collect firewood and check on livestock, their breath forming white clouds in the still air. By noon, a thin layer of clouds had moved in from the northwest, but nothing suggested the catastrophe building beyond the horizon. The first warning came from the horses. Around 2 o'clock, every animal in the settlement began showing signs of distress, pawing at the ground, pressing against windbreaks, refusing to graze despite clear skies. Old-timers recognized the behavior, but hoped they were wrong. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than anyone had instruments to measure, and somewhere beyond the rolling hills, a massive weather system was gathering strength. At 4:30, the wind arrived without fanfare. A steady breeze from the northwest quickly intensified into sustained gusts that rattled windows and sent loose debris skittering across the frozen ground. Within an hour, the gusts reached 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the prairie. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards as the storm engulfed the scattered homesteads. By 6 o'clock, the wind was howling at 50 miles per hour, and the temperature had plummeted to 10 below zero. Jim Caldwell's log cabin began its fight for survival almost immediately. The constant wind pressure against the north wall found every weakness in the chinking, driving, frigid air through gaps that had seemed minor during calmer weather. The single-thickness log walls, adequate for Kentucky winters, provided no buffer against the sustained assault. Snow filtered through cracks around the windows and doors, forming small drifts on the interior floors. Caldwell stuffed blankets against the worst gaps, but each repair revealed two new problems. The stone fireplace, positioned against the exterior north wall, according to traditional practice, became a liability rather than an asset. The chimney drew poorly against the fierce headwind, filling the cabin with smoke whenever Caldwell tried to build up the fire. Worse, the stones absorbed cold from the exterior wall and radiated it into the living space. By midnight, ice was forming on the hearth itself, something Caldwell had never imagined possible. His family, huddled in the south corner of the single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, burning furniture to maintain any heat at all. The school teacher's frame house fared even worse. The thin plank walls flexed visibly under the wind pressure, creaking and groaning like a ship in heavy seas. Snow found its way through gaps between boards that had seemed tight during construction, creating a fine powder that accumulated in corners and refused to melt despite the desperate heat from her small stove. She discovered that her water bucket had frozen solid while sitting 3 feet from the fire, a clear indication that the building was losing the battle against the elements. The dugout families faced their own catastrophe as the storm's fury exceeded all expectations. The underground structures that had seemed naturally insulated proved vulnerable to a different set of problems. Moisture from breathing and cooking, trapped in the confined spaces, condensed on the frozen earth walls and formed sheets of ice. The Schmidt family woke at 2 a.m. to find their youngest daughter unconscious from cold, her lips blue despite sleeping between her parents under multiple quilts. They managed to revive her by the fire, but her breathing remained shallow and labored. 3 miles east, the German family's sod house began its final collapse around midnight. The sandy soil construction that had barely held together during milder weather simply disintegrated under the combined assault of wind and cold. Chunks of frozen earth fell away from the walls in large sections, leaving gaping holes that no amount of emergency patching could seal. By dawn, They were essentially living outdoors with a partial roof overhead, burning pieces of their furniture in a desperate attempt to create a warming fire in the ruins of their home. The wind reached its peak intensity around 3 in the morning, sustained speeds of 55 miles per hour with gusts approaching 60. The temperature had dropped to 22 below zero, creating a wind chill that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Snow drifted against buildings faster than it could blow away, creating massive accumulations that added structural stress to already failing constructions. Meanwhile, inside the Jensen straw bale house, an entirely different reality existed. The 2-foot-thick compressed grass walls, sealed with gumbo mud plaster, absorbed the storm's assault without transmitting its effects to the interior. The hollow structure of the grass stems created thousands of tiny air pockets that formed an insulating barrier no conventional construction could match. While neighboring families burned through their entire winter fuel supplies in a single night, Jensen maintained comfortable temperatures with modest additions to his fire every few hours. The thick walls not only retained heat, but also eliminated the infiltration problems that plagued conventional structures. The plaster coating, applied over a wire mesh, had cured into an airtight shell that winds simply could not penetrate. Snow that accumulated against the exterior walls actually added to the insulation effect rather than creating thermal bridges or moisture problems. The interior temperature remained steady at 65 degrees, while families 50 yards away were fighting for survival at 20 degrees indoors. Most remarkably, the straw bale construction dampened sound as effectively as it retained heat. While other families listened to their homes creaking, groaning, and threatening to collapse under the storm's fury, the Jensen household experienced an almost eerie calm. The children slept soundly through the worst of the blizzard, unaware that their neighbors were spending the night convinced they might not see morning. At dawn on January 22nd, the first desperate knocking came at Jensen's door. Caldwell stood outside, his face gray with cold, despite a thick scarf, carrying his youngest son wrapped in blankets. The boy's feet had gone numb during the night, and Caldwell feared frostbite. Behind him waited the school teacher, her lips blue and her hands shaking uncontrollably. They had abandoned their failing shelters and trudged through waist-deep snow to reach the only structure still maintaining livable conditions. Jensen opened his door without hesitation, welcoming them into warmth that felt like a miracle after the frozen hell they had endured. More figures were already visible through the blowing snow, making their way toward the straw bale house that had transformed overnight from community joke to community salvation. By morning of January 23rd, the storm had exhausted itself, leaving behind a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Snow drifts reached the eaves of single-story buildings, and the bitter wind had sculpted the prairie into an alien geography of ridges and valleys. As the sun broke through scattered clouds, the true extent of the catastrophe became visible across the scattered homesteads of Cherry County. The toll was devastating and precise. Of 12 families that had attempted to winter in conventional structures within a 5-mile radius of Jensen's homestead, 7 had suffered complete structural failures. Caldwell's log cabin stood intact but uninhabitable. The constant infiltration had created a coating of ice on every interior surface, and the stone fireplace had cracked from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The schoolteacher's frame house had lost its entire north wall, the thin planks simply blown away during the peak winds. 3 dugout families had been forced to abandon their underground shelters when ice formation made breathing dangerous and heating impossible. Most tragic was the German family whose sod house had disintegrated entirely. They had spent the storm's worst hours huddled under a wagon in the ruins of their home, burning pieces of furniture and clothing to maintain a small fire. The father had suffered severe frostbite on both hands, and their 6-year-old daughter showed early signs of pneumonia from prolonged exposure to sub-zero temperatures. Only the intervention of neighbors who carried them through the drifts to Jensen's house had prevented what would certainly have been the settlement's first weather-related deaths. The Schmidt family emerged from their dugout to discover that moisture from their breathing had created a solid shell of ice on the interior walls. The underground space that had promised natural insulation had become a tomb of frozen earth that radiated cold more effectively than it retained heat. Their youngest child had survived the night only because they had shared body heat under every blanket they owned, taking turns staying awake to maintain the fire that kept hypothermia at bay. In stark contrast, the Jensen family had slept soundly through the entire ordeal. The straw bale house maintained interior temperatures of 65 degrees throughout the storm with minimal fuel consumption, perhaps 1/10 the wood that neighboring families had burned while fighting for survival. The thick walls showed no signs of stress or infiltration, and the interior remained perfectly dry despite the blizzard's moisture. Most remarkably, Jensen calculated that he had used less firewood during the 3-day crisis than Caldwell typically burned in a single normal winter day. Word of the dramatic survival differences spread through the snowbound community faster than anyone could travel the buried roads. Families who had ridiculed the haystack house now found themselves dependent on its warmth for their lives. The Jensen home became a refugee center, sheltering 14 people at its peak capacity, 7 adults and 7 children from 5 different families. The structure that skeptics had dismissed as temporary proved spacious enough to accommodate them all comfortably while conventional homes lay in ruins around it. Jensen opened his home without reservation, sharing not only warmth but also food and practical knowledge. As families recovered from their ordeal, they began asking detailed questions about construction techniques they had previously dismissed as foolish. How did he achieve such airtight walls? What prevented the straw from rotting or attracting rodents? How much did the materials cost compared to conventional building supplies? Jensen answered each question patiently, demonstrating the principles that had saved their lives. The technical explanations revealed the elegant science behind what appeared to be simple construction. Each straw bale contained millions of hollow grass stems, creating air spaces that trapped still air and prevented heat transfer through conduction. When compressed to 90 pounds per bale and stacked in running bond pattern, these natural tubes formed an insulating barrier with an R value exceeding 10 times the insulating capacity of single-wall log construction. The gumbo mud, plaster, mixed with local clay and chopped straw, dried into an airtight seal that eliminated the infiltration problems that had doomed conventional structures. Equally important was the thermal mass effect of the thick walls. During sunny winter days, the bales absorbed heat and stored it in their compressed organic material, then released this warmth gradually through the night. This natural heating system reduced fuel requirements while maintaining steady temperatures that prevented the freeze-thaw cycles destructive to both buildings and human health. The positioning of Jensen's fireplace in the center of the structure, rather than against an exterior wall, maximized heat retention and eliminated the cold radiation that had made Caldwell's stone chimney a liability rather than an asset. Reverend Samuel Weaver, who had weathered the storm in town, arrived 3 days after the blizzard to find his scattered congregation gathered in the straw bale house. His validation carried significant weight in the community. Here was an educated man who had traveled widely and seen various survival techniques used across the frontier. "This is precisely what I observed among the Mandan people along the Missouri River," he told the assembled families. "Earth lodges that used the same principles of thick insulation and central heating, indigenous knowledge adapted to available materials." By February, even before the snow had fully melted, 3 families began making plans to build straw bale homes before the next winter. The Schmidt family, whose dugout had nearly killed them, started gathering prairie grass as soon as it was accessible. They had seen firsthand that survival depended not on following tradition, but on using techniques that actually worked in local conditions. Caldwell, his pride wounded but his family alive, began quietly inquiring about baling equipment and construction details. The schoolteacher, whose frame house was a total loss, announced her intention to rebuild using straw bale construction. She had spent 4 nights in Jensen's home during the storm's aftermath and experienced the profound difference that proper insulation made in daily comfort and fuel efficiency. Her decision carried particular significance because teachers were expected to demonstrate conventional respectability. Her adoption of the technique signaled broader community acceptance. Jensen found himself transformed overnight from community eccentric to local expert. Neighbors who had mocked his methods now sought his advice on everything from bale compression techniques to plaster recipes. He shared his knowledge freely, explaining how to notch bales for door and window frames, how to secure walls with wooden pins, and how to achieve the proper mixture of clay, sand, and chopped straw for exterior plastering. The survival of his neighbors depended on the same principles that had saved his own family, and he understood that community resilience required shared knowledge rather than individual secrets. Spring arrived late in 1899, but by May the surviving families had begun the practical work of rebuilding their lives around lessons learned in January's crucible. Jensen returned to his normal routines, tending crops, repairing equipment, caring for livestock, but the quiet requests for construction advice continued throughout the growing season. He never mentioned the storm or gloated about his vindication. When neighbors asked about wall thickness or bale spacing, he answered with the same patient precision he brought to discussing seed varieties or irrigation techniques. The first disciples began construction that summer. The Schmidt family, haunted by their near-death experience in the failed dugout, built their straw bale house methodically under Jensen's guidance. They learned to compress bales to precisely 90 pounds for optimal density, stack them in running bond with joints staggered 18 inches, and secure each course with sharpened wooden pins driven through multiple layers. Their walls rose to 22 inches thick, slightly thinner than Jensen's original design, but still providing an R value of 45, more than adequate for prairie conditions. The school teacher's replacement structure incorporated refinements learned from the January disaster. She positioned her fireplace centrally rather than against an exterior wall, eliminating the cold radiation that had made her frame house uninhabitable. Her bale walls included wire mesh reinforcement before plastering, creating an even more durable shell than the original gumbo mud technique. The finished building looked conventional from a distance, white plastered walls and standard roofing, but provided comfort and fuel efficiency that amazed visiting school officials. By 1900, 7 straw bale structures had been completed in Cherry County, ranging from family homes to a small church that served 3 rural congregations. Each builder adapted the basic technique to local needs and available materials, creating variations that proved the method's flexibility. Some used lime-based stucco instead of clay plaster. Others experimented with different bale dimensions, but all achieved the fundamental goal of creating thick, insulating walls from abundant prairie grass. The techniques spread quietly through informal networks of neighbors, helping neighbors. When families moved on to new homesteads, they carried construction knowledge along with household goods. A family that relocated from Cherry County to Holt County built Nebraska's first 2-story straw bale house in 1902, proving the method could support significant structural loads. Ranchers discovered that straw bale barns maintained comfortable temperatures for livestock while requiring minimal heating, making winter feeding operations more efficient and less costly. Documentation of the building boom reveals the scope of adoption across the Sandhills. County records and homestead applications show that between 1896 and 1945, at least 70 straw bale structures were built in the region: houses, barns, schools, churches, and even a small store in the town of Arthur. Most used variations of Jensen's original technique, with walls ranging from 18 to 24 inches thick and R values consistently exceeding conventional construction by factors of 5 to 10. The most remarkable testament to the method's durability stands today in the form of the Pilgrim Holiness Church constructed in 1928 near Arthur, Nebraska. Built with walls of compressed rye straw bales nearly 2 feet thick, the structure has survived 9 decades of prairie weather with minimal maintenance. The National Register of Historic Places recognized the building in 1986, noting that its straw bale construction represents a significant example of vernacular architecture adapted to local environmental conditions and available materials. Other structures from the early period demonstrated similar longevity. The Faulkner House, built in 1903 using Jensen's exact specifications, remained occupied continuously until 1978, when the family finally sold the homestead. New owners reported that interior temperatures stayed comfortable year-round with minimal heating and cooling costs. The Martin Barn, constructed in 1908, housed cattle through 70 winters before finally being demolished in 1978, not because of structural failure, but because modern farming operations required larger facilities. The technique's quiet success attracted attention from agricultural extension agents and university researchers during the 1930s. A study conducted by the Nebraska Agricultural Experiment Station documented fuel savings of 60 to 70% compared to conventional frame construction, along with superior comfort during both summer heat and winter cold. The report noted that straw bale walls naturally regulated humidity, preventing the condensation problems that plagued dugouts and poorly insulated buildings. World War II temporarily ended straw bale construction as materials and labor shifted to war production, but the technique experienced an unexpected renaissance in the late 20th century. Environmental consciousness and energy efficiency concerns sparked renewed interest in what researchers now called natural building methods. The same principles that had saved lives during the hard winter of 1899 appealed to homeowners facing energy crises and seeking sustainable alternatives to conventional construction. Modern building codes began recognizing straw bale construction during the 1980s and 90s, establishing engineering standards and inspection protocols for load-bearing bale walls. States including Nebraska, Colorado, and New Mexico developed specific regulations governing straw bale buildings, acknowledging their energy efficiency and structural viability. Contemporary builders discovered they could achieve even better performance by combining traditional techniques with modern materials, cement-based stuccos, moisture barriers, and engineered foundations that extended building life indefinitely. Jensen lived to see his community's complete transformation from skepticism to adoption, though he remained characteristically modest about his role in the change. When a newspaper reporter visited in 1925 to write about the straw bale pioneer, Jensen attributed his success to Norwegian building traditions and common sense rather than any special innovation. "The prairie grass was here all along," he observed. "People just needed to see it as building material instead of cattle feed." The broader lesson extended far beyond construction techniques. When conventional wisdom collided with environmental reality, survival belonged to those who adapted rather than those who insisted on tradition. The Jensen family's warm nights during the hard winter came not from superior materials or advanced technology, but from recognizing that local resources, properly understood and applied, could outperform imported solutions designed for different conditions. In a landscape where trees were scarce and winters brutal, compressed prairie grass proved more practical than logs, more durable than sod, and more economical than shipped lumber. The mockery that greeted his haystack house had transformed into the quiet adoption that saved lives and established a building tradition lasting more than a century.